have the topic of does gender and actually also race, it's the intersection of gender and race and the effect it has on political campaigns. And what do we have to do in order to instill confidence in voters that women can carry the job of president truly? So I've talked about the competing schools of thought, those that think it doesn't matter at all anymore, and those who think it's probably the single most important reason why we're not making any headway with women candidates. Today we've got three different presenters. Our first one is Elise Shaw, who directs the Institute for Women's Policy Research projects on the status of women in the United States, women's political participation, and projects related to women and girls of color, which examine the intersectional nature of race and gender on women's lives. She will look at the significant gaps and barriers of women entering the field and staying on to win. And next we have Monique, who's the Chief Operating Officer at Rockaville, which is a nonprofit advocacy organization using the power of art, music, technology, and pop culture to engage young people in politics. Her area of expertise is on race and ethnicity, inequality, and political participation. She will address the intersection of race and gender as it affects women's rise to political office, particularly Latinx women. And finally, but not least, we have Janice Memphis, who is the Executive Director of the National Council for Legal Women. His broad-based experience as a lawyer, a negotiator, an advocate, an administrator, and a team builder. She formerly served as the General Counsel and Chief of Staff of Rainbow Push. She will examine the political challenges of women, especially women of color, getting into office.
First, thank you all for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. It's one of my passions in life, to talk about women in politics. If you can't hear me at any time, let me know. I can talk louder. So, as Connie mentioned earlier, a lot of people have been saying we're kind of in this. Are we in this post-gender time? We have more women running for office and getting elected to office than ever before. Currently, women's representation in the U.S. Congress is at an all-time high at about almost 24%, which is fantastic. And women of color make up 8.8% of the seats in Congress as well. When it comes to state legislatures, women are faring slightly better. They make up about 29% of all state legislators, which is fantastic. Again, almost 30%. But women of color are actually lagging further behind in state legislatures. They make up only about 7% of all seats. So though women are running and getting elected at higher shares, it doesn't mean that the barriers are gone or eliminated. Obviously, the share of women in office is still far below our share of the population. So women are about 51%, and yet only about 24% in the U.S. Congress. And women of color constitute about 20% of the population in the U.S., so they even have a lot further to go to kind of bridge that gap of what their representation looks like compared to what their current population status is. The share of women in office also varies greatly by state. 16 states currently have no female representative in the U.S. Congress, and there is one state that has never sent a woman to either the U.S. House or Senate, and that is Vermont. So it used to be Vermont and Mississippi recently just sent their first woman, so now we can say not two states, but only one state has not sent. According to IDPR's most recent calculations, which we will actually be releasing on Tuesday, so you guys get a little sneak preview, if the current rate of progress remains the same, we have calculated that women will reach parity in elected office, so 50% in the U.S. Congress, in the year 2108.
Wow.
So 88 years. And that's
I don't live that long.
No. Yes. So that's a really long time. A little bit of progress since the last time we did the projection, which was in 2013. We projected the year 2121. So we've made a little bit of progress. But there are still significant gaps and barriers. I'm going to highlight some of the research we've done on this. We did some interviews in 2012 with women who were either current office holders, which included kind of established office holders, as well as young elected officials, and then congressional staff members, which are kind of the pool of women that often get tapped to run for office. And we interviewed them about the barriers they feel like they face, or their experiences running, getting elected, and staying in office, and also getting elected to higher office. So this comes from that research study. I'm going to highlight, it's a really long and in-depth report. I suggest everyone check it out, but I'm going to highlight a few of the key issues that came up. Obviously, one of the biggest issues that women talked about is money. And raising money. Fundraising is a huge issue, especially given at the national level how much money people have to raise these days to get elected to office, to run their campaigns. The first thing that women talked about is learning how to make the ask. But while this was something that a lot of women, especially younger women, kind of felt uncomfortable with, this is something that they said, oh yeah, if I take a training, I'll feel much better. Or I took a training and now I feel much better. So that's actually pretty low-hanging fruit that is easily addressed. The second one is developing meaningful and lasting relationships with donors. So a lot of women really talk about how they have a hard time kind of developing the deeper relationship that is necessary to have a full career in politics. It's not just a one-off, donate to my campaign, but really establishing those relationships. And then third is having a lack of access to a good call list. Again, reliable, untapped donors that they can call when needed. The second and third barriers that women really talked about, I find are really, really important because they're harder to kind of address. It talks to the old boys network that is still alive in politics. Experienced office holders and power brokers who develop these lists and these contacts and develop these relationships are less likely to share these with female candidates and office holders. Female candidates, especially those who are trying to build the long-term career in politics and advance up through the ranks, need more than mentors. They need what we're calling sponsors. They need people who are going to help them make connections, establish relationships, and really build their career, and really tap into these networks of not just people to know, but moneyed connections that really takes to stay in politics. Women also cited in our study that they're less likely to receive support by the political parties or those in powerful positions. And we call those as kind of the power brokers within the politics world. Of those interviewed, 51% said they had never received a suggestion to run for office or higher office from their political party leaders. And these are women some of these women are already in office and they've never been tapped, either to run for a higher office or anything else. And 71% said they never received a suggestion to run for office from a power broker. So not necessarily their political party leader, but somebody who is very influential in their party and in politics. They also reported, and I found this really interesting, that they're most likely to have mentors that are either other female elected officials or former male elected officials, so not currently in office. And then the second the most mentioned people to act as mentors or supporters were other women and feminists. So women's networks, as you can see, are still, and support systems are still very gendered. They're receiving support from other women and men who are not necessarily in the current positions of power, as they reported to us. So this is really interesting to me, again, just showing how skewed the system is and the networks are. Another big issue, which I think will be no shocker here, was what we titled Campaigning While Female. And 9 in 10 participants reported that they felt their campaign experience differed from men's. And they went more in depth to these. They reported receiving inappropriate and sexist treatment, not just from the media, but from political groups, peers and colleagues, donors, and the political parties themselves. So pretty much everyone. And the comments and behaviors reported, the most frequent ones reported, ranged from comments and focus on their hair and clothes. Of course, as we know, oftentimes women's hair and clothes get commented on more often, to women's roles as mothers. So oftentimes there was the suggestion that mothers should not serve or run for office, should not run for higher office, what's going on with your kids, who's taking care of them, all those kind of questions, all the way to sexual harassment, just outright sexual harassment. And in fact, sexual harassment by colleagues and donors was reported to be one of the biggest problems that women in elected office face. So parallel but kind of distinct from the campaigning while female, women reported experiencing just overt discrimination. Nearly 3 in 4 participants reported they have experienced discrimination while in the political sphere. So much higher than women experience it in kind of any other job that they hold. So this, again, a range of behaviors in here in this discrimination. Smaller donation amounts from donors was a key one that was reported. Reduced party financial support, so less support from the political party itself. A failure to provide promised party services even, so not only just less financial support, but just general support from the political party. Fewer speaking opportunities, and having meetings refused or phone calls going unreturned. So these are just women who are kind of reaching out, looking for support, and really not finding it. In some cases, and this was a few cases, but something that we really felt we should highlight, women reported being bullied by political party leaders, their peers, and other elected office holders in an effort to dissuade them from running at all or from serving in higher office, so running for higher office as well. So this was a really interesting one to hear that not only were they not receiving the support, but sometimes they were just being outright bullied to say, don't do it. And again, probably no surprise to anybody in this room, but career and family obligations are still a major barrier to women running for and holding elected office. The women we interviewed volunteered a number of ways that this impacts their lives and the number of ways that they work around these challenges, but it really was something that women talked about a lot in our interviews, was that they had to work around these challenges. It's something that they had to strategically think about. So oftentimes women talked about, well, I chose to run at this time because I don't have children or as many care responsibilities. So I'm a single woman running. I don't either, it's before they have children, after their children are grown and out of the house, but they don't have the same care responsibilities. Women who did have care responsibilities talked about having either a husband or a close family member actually act as their campaign manager to help kind of alleviate some of the responsibilities of juggling their personal and political life. Or having a husband who is a stay-at-home dad, which was huge for a lot of the women, especially who are in higher office, or agrees to share in more of the family care responsibilities since they predominantly fall on the woman. Also, the women talked about having another family member, usually either their parent or an in-law, act as a primary caregiver for their children as well. And one thing that we heard a lot as well was, well, I pursued this office because it's either part-time or the commitment is local. So it's close to my house, I don't have to travel so far, or I have hours that I can balance between my care responsibilities, any other work obligations, and my family. So again, keeping women from really pursuing higher levels of office. So that was a big one. One really interesting thing that I always highlight is ambition, which a lot of people talk about, like women are not as motivated to run for office, was not an issue with the women we interviewed. Most actually self-recruited for their first office or campaign. Only 1 in 4 said that someone else recruited them to run for office. So ambition was not an issue with these women. They are self-starters, they're go-getters. But again, this is kind of part of the problem. So our study also found that these women are more likely to be motivated to run for office in order to fix a problem that they see. No one else is kind of fixing this problem either in their community, at a broader level, and so they say, well, I'm going to run for office, no one else is addressing this, I feel passionately about it, I'm going to run. While this is a great motivator, it means that women are less likely to view politics as a long-term career. So while men are more likely to say, well, I'm going to go into politics, I'm going to get into politics, that's going to be my career, women are less likely to view it as a career, even from a young age. So the younger women we talked to really talked about how no one really talked to them about politics as a career option for them, or something that they should even think about. given that most women enter politics at the state or local level and work their way up, this is a problem because it means that if you're having women who are running for office at older ages, they're less likely to reach the U.S. Congress and really to feel like they want to pursue that level of office holding. So we end our report with a few things that we think can be done based on the feedback given to us by the women we interviewed. Really launching an all-scale effort to build the political pipeline. So this is a huge, obviously that's a huge endeavor, but it includes expanding and reinforcing the pipeline by recruiting and training young women, really talking to them about politics as a career option. Think about it. It's a viable option for people who want to get into the world and make things better for their communities. Really looking at the range of issues used to assess and evaluate female candidates that oftentimes political parties will use. Is this a viable candidate? Well, what makes a person a viable candidate? Are those very gendered issues? Or is that what you're looking at? Is this kind of looking at it, leading as a male versus leading as a female? Those are very gendered connotations oftentimes in people's heads. And then mapping out potential races and open seats well in advance of the openings and working to place women as credible candidates in competitive races early on. I think that's something that really political parties can really focus on. Obviously, expanding and enhancing existing training for women would be fantastic. There's a lot of really great trainings out there. If we could get more women into them, teach them kind of the nuts and bolts and the basics of running for campaigns, that would be fantastic. Providing increased mentoring, but also sponsorship for female candidates and elected officials. So again, really trying to break down that old boys network. That's a harder one to tackle because it's more it's insidious.
You have a smaller group to pull from too.
Exactly. Yes. So if you're only pulling from women to go to women, you have a very small group of power brokers to pull from. So you really need to expand that and kind of break down those networks. Increase the understanding of fundraising complexities, which is really crucial for women who are running for office. Teaching women how to make the ask is pretty easy, but getting women to understand the need for building up these networks, for having sustained donors, for really tapping into those things is really crucial. And political parties need to recruit and ask women to run for office more often. This is really a huge gap that really needs to be tackled. And then advocating for institutional reforms, obviously tackling issues of harassment and discrimination while women are running for office. And then there's also other things like ranked choice voting, which has been proven to be much better for women getting elected to office. It's been piloted in a few states, and it's a really great way of getting more women into elected office at a faster rate. It's still pretty new, but it's where it's been used, it's more women get elected to office, which is fantastic. And of course, make campaigning and office holding family friendly would be fantastic. That would get more women who are childbearing and rearing age into office. So, providing family schedules, on-site daycare, using additional, I know nationally you can use some campaign funds to pay for childcare, but making that at the state and local level as well, expanding that ability to use those funds a little more flexibly would be great. But those are just some of the highlights from the research that we've done around this issue. I know I said we did it in 2012, but it's still very pertinent to what's going on for women today. It just really shows that women have to work harder and longer to get into elected office.
What else is new?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, hello everyone. Sue and Connie, I'm delighted to be here with you today again. I think it's maybe the second or third time that I've been a presenter for the Clearinghouse on Women's Issues. And it's important to us and it's important to NCNW. Coincidentally, this morning I was doing some background gathering up talking points for Janetta Cole, who is our president now. Some of you know that Dr. Cole ran the Smithsonian and Spelman College and Bennett College. She's in town today, and actually I'm supposed to be in a staff meeting, but I'm here and glad to be here. And she's doing a podcast with Mr. Clyburn up on the hill Thursday morning, and he wants to talk to her about HBCUs, but also about Mary McLeod Bethune, who some of you know was the founder of NCNW back in 1935. And as I was thinking about what I would say here to you today, at the same time coming up with bullet points about Dr. Bethune, it was not hard to come to the conclusion that the more things change in some ways, the more they stay the same. If anybody would have been a great elected official, it would have been Mary McLeod Bethune. She was interested in education, she was interested in workers' rights, she was interested in ending the horrors of lynching and other forms of post-slavery discrimination. But I suspect it probably never occurred to the people that surrounded her that she would make an ideal political candidate. She was an eloquent speaker. If you've seen the exhibit at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, she had a beautiful voice and a lovely way of speaking. She was a great fundraiser. She built all kinds of institutions, but she never ran for political office. And so here we are. I was thinking about, can I have the next slide? I'm not going to go through these statistics, because I think Elise's are probably better than mine. I will say though that of the women of color who are in the United States Congress, about 40% of them are women of color, are black. Of the women of color who are in Congress, about 40% of them are black women, and so to that extent they tend to outrepresent their peers. But I want to talk a little bit about why I think that is at the end. Interestingly enough, some studies don't count Rashida Tlaib as black. North Africa, I guess, doesn't make you black. They say she's Middle Eastern. And of course, Stacey Plaskett is from the Virgin Islands, so I guess that makes her not black too. Let's move on to the next slide. These are the black women who are currently in Congress, and if you see those little asterisks, you can see that about half of them are pretty new. Half of them have been elected since 2016. Alma Adams has been there a long time, Karen Bass, Joyce Beatty, but Lisa Blunt is new. Val Demings is new. Johanna Hayes is new. Brenda Lawrence is new. Alana Omar, Ayanna Presley. And I think that goes to your point about women being issues driven. We hosted a coffee warming station on the day of the Women's March, the day of inauguration in 2017. And there was palpable sorrow, just gut-wrenching pain and sorrow. I happened to be at Spelman College on election night doing a live radio broadcast from Spelman College campus. And for those of us who've been around politics a little bit longer, we saw the handwriting on the wall fairly early in the evening. But for many of the young women in the audience, you're talking about juniors and seniors in college, it wasn't until later in the evening that it became apparent to them when Michigan and Pennsylvania and North Carolina and Wisconsin, I'm bringing back bad memories. But as those states started to come in and young women who were less familiar with the Electoral College and how it works started to, and I didn't want to tell them, it's done, we can start packing. But I as it seeped in, that realization, there was that same palpable sense of sorrow. And frankly, a healthy dose of anger. I think if you talk to a lot of black women activists, you will hear them say things like, didn't they know? How could they not tell? How could 53% of white women make this choice? A little bit of driving Miss Daisy syndrome. Telling Miss Daisy to get in the front seat and drive and let somebody else figure out where we're going. And so I think what you're seeing here is evidence that women of color say, look, we get this, clearly we understand this, and we're willing to make the sacrifice and do what's necessary to take the risk to be elected. We're not going to listen to what men have to say a whole lot, and we're not going to listen to what other folk have to say to us. This is our future, our grandchildren, our children, and our country, and we're ready and willing and able to lead. Let's go to the next slide. And of course, Latinx representation is increasing, not quickly enough. and then you see AOC is listed among the Latinos because we claim her too. that gets into that whole quandary about whether whether being Latin is ethnic. It's certainly not racial, but that's not really what matters. What matters is that this is the future. This is where we're going, and whatever those obstacles are, the money, the mentors. There will be more Nancy Pelosi's, more power brokers who are women, who will be able to scoop up other women and encourage them. And I know we've been patient for a long time, but not as patient and not for as long as my grandmother had to be. Let's move to the next. Mayors. Now, interesting, I wrote down the word when you were speaking, Elyse, that it's about money and contacts and name recognition and causes. But ultimately, the question is a question of power. It's a question of power. And the reason I wanted to highlight some of these mayors, when you're the mayor of a city like Charlotte or Washington, D.C., that comes with the right smart amount of power. The ability to get things done. The ability to influence the circumstances and conditions around you. Writing budgets. Hiring large staffs of people. And that is where I think the future of black political activists who are women is at Keisha Lance Bottoms in Atlanta. So far, these cities have not blown up. They've not sunk into the sea. Women are running them in some of the most important cities, especially in the South. Isn't that interesting? Where you can't elect a black state senator in the South unless they are arch conservative. But in cities, women tend to do a little bit better. And I guess we can all theorize about the reasons for that. Women do better when they're being elected from districts as opposed to statewide, especially if you're a black woman. It's hard to get elected statewide if you're from Georgia. We can ask our friend Stacey Abrams about that. Is that there is as much of Georgia outside of 285 in Atlanta as there is on the inside. For all that urban affluence, there's just as much rural, undereducated, underemployed population in Georgia outside of Atlanta as there is inside. Illinois is the same way. There are lots of states where you have sort of a tale of two states. The cities, Philadelphia is one thing, Western Pennsylvania is something else.
Virginia's the same way.
Virginia's the same way. That women tend to, and I love to see what it looks like when women run from urban as opposed to less developed areas. Let's see what's on the next slide. Y'all have to understand I did this like in 20 minutes. Factors contributing to the rise of women of color holding political office. And I've done no scientific studies. I have no data to back this up. This is from Janice's gut reaction. So take that with a big teaspoon of salt. I think the inspiration of Barack Obama raised the ceiling on what's possible. That he was such an inspiring and a transformative figure that people, men, women, black, white, were inspired to do things they might not otherwise do. And just as importantly, the election of his successor, President Trump, has had an impact on people of color. A sort of woe is me, what have we done? What has America become? Where are we going? What can we do? And it's not that he is new, it's that he is extreme. These views are not new. Ronald Reagan went to South Carolina, flirted around with the people at Bob Jones University, and go to Mississippi and make nice with the Confederates down there. But to do it in your face, and to do it without apology, without remorse, without any apparent understanding of how the government works or is supposed to work, and no curiosity about learning. But then I consider my family came here in the 1780s, and his came here in the 1950s. I got more reason and more right to be a loyal American than he does. The other thing is the rise of organizations, partly spurred by the phenomenon of Barack Obama, and partly I think just naturally is there more and more organizations that are promoting women in politics, whether it's as candidates and office holders or as operatives, fundraisers. One of our tenants in our building is the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. And they've been doing this whole push about getting people of color into roles as chiefs of staff, legislative directors, committee counsel, because that in some ways is the pipeline into federal office. Right now, Lindsey Graham down in South Carolina's got a young fellow named Jamie running against him. Well, guess where Jamie was working? So you see new and old organizations like Power Rising, which is a very new organization in its second year, convened about 1,500 black women in Atlanta the first year, and now probably a couple thousand in Baltimore this year in a few weeks, the end of April, to talk about women in a variety of fields in their careers and their work lives, but also as political actors. Delta Sigma Theta is a very old organization. Been around since 1913. I spent the last 3 days with them on their Delta Days on the Hill, Delta Days in the nation's capital. About 1,500 of them in red at the Capitol right now. And yesterday, and in our meetings leading up to yesterday, we have decided to establish a political action committee and a 501c4. So that being nonpartisan and 501c3 is not satisfying the urge for change that these legacy organizations feel. And that if we're truly going to be effective change agents, then we have to be willing to take more risk and to change our structure. And there is some, as you can imagine, spirited debate inside the 200,000 member organization of Delta Sigma Theta about changing the way we operate so that we can be more effective politically. Not everyone in the organization is in support of that. But those of us who think that a larger platform is a good thing are slowly but surely reasoning with and bringing our sisters around to that point of view. The group that I'm referring to is the Social Action Commission. That's what we've been.
Is that NCMW?
No, that's Delta Sigma Theta.
Sigma Theta.
Oh, okay.
I'm a 40-year member of Delta Sigma Theta.
So that's what
See
you're
this
talking about.
Delta around my neck. But I'm executive director of the National Council of Negro Women. Sorry for it being confusing, but there's a lot of overlap.
Yes.
Dorothy Height, who was president of Delta Sigma Theta for decades, was also president of NCNW for decades. And so there's a lot of overlap. Delta has a seat on our board, as do 32 other women's organizations have permanent seats on the board of NCNW. It was really conceptualized brilliantly by Bethune as an organization of organizations, a collaborative by definition. She's slated to get a statue in Statuary Hall later this year. She'll be replacing a Confederate general.
Right on.
And she beat out the CEO of Publix, which is based in Florida. Florida legislature had to vote for that designation, and so we're very excited about that. But there's Delta, there's Power Rising, there's Move On. The other thing about it that I think is spurring women of younger generations than mine is the weight of history. Delta Sigma Theta actually got started marching down Pennsylvania Avenue for suffrage in 1913. They were asked to come up the rear of the line because that was the etiquette of the day. How long is too long to take back seat? Mary McLeod Bethune would have been a great political actor. So would Dorothy Height. Dorothy Height was at the Lincoln Memorial the day that Dr. King gave the I Have a Dream speech, and there are all kinds of rumors, tales about why she didn't speak. Some people say the more charitable view is she gave up her spot for John Lewis. The other view is she was a girl, so she didn't get to talk. You take your choice about which you choose to believe. But having said that, she was designated as one of the so-called Big Six. Barack Obama called her the godfather of the civil rights movement, but she had no official, formal. She had the power of her personality, the power of her ability to make friends and influence people, but not the roles that went along with being president of the NAACP or founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. If ever there was an old boys club or a young boys club, take your pick, it was that civil rights movement of the mid 1960s that designated women to have certain positions, and I think younger generations of women are just done with that.
Yeah.
They're just not gonna put up with it, not going to accept that as something they can't do anything about. And then I already talked about nonprofit fatigue. That you can go right up to the line of advocating for something, but you have to stop and make sure that it's not a significant portion of your budget and that you're not being overtly partisan. And it just seems for these times when we're facing democratic norms being undermined, it seems just too much to ask, too big of a burden to bear. I know the unions struggle with this as well,
Yeah.
and people are feeling like they don't want their voices artificially muffled. And so I think, in spite of the things that we've not yet done, I'm optimistic that this is going to be a great time for women in leadership. I think President Obama said we'd all be better off when more women hold office. Well, for sure there'll be fewer wars. Next, I think this is the last. And so some of the organizations, there was a Black Women's Political Action Committee organized back in 1983. So this is not new. But the pace at which they're being organized, if we could go to the final slide, has really accelerated. And so there's a collective pact, Higher Heights for America, the Black Economic Alliance, and Colored Change, and many others that are specifically aimed at helping women of color get elected. Not just be in supportive roles, speech writers. I'll end with a personal sort of little story. Back in probably 1990, I thought about running for Congress. Be fun. I was living in Georgia, living in Athens, fairly well known, knew a lot of legislators, a lot of politicians. Thought I was ready, good command of econ, lawyer, public policy major, fairly good education. Thought it might be fun. The part that daunted me was the fundraising. The idea of calling everybody I know and asking them for money. Now, I've been begging for money for organizations my entire adult life. For the Rainbow Push Coalition, for NCNW, for Delta, for the League of Women Voters, but for my own campaign, it seemed sacrilegious that I just couldn't do it. The other reason I couldn't do it was that I was married to a person who was himself an elected official. And so I knew lots of elected officials. I was also president at that time of the League of Women Voters of Athens, Georgia. They asked me to step down from being president of the league when he ran for office. And I thought, that can't be right. This is the League of Women Voters. They can't care who I'm married to. Well, I did step down for a year or so until his campaign was over, and then we went back. But those are the kind of real life issues. And then my mother had cancer, my father had Alzheimer's. And so all of the reasons that you cited, the personal, the political, the financial, all of those reasons. Now, I probably would have got my behind kicked anyway. Because the woman who decided to run was Vince Dooley's wife. Those of you who don't follow big-time college football don't know that Vince Dooley was the long-time football coach at the University of Georgia. But she got beat anyway. But that's just from personal experience. That's what women are faced with making these decisions. They're tough decisions. And it's good to have this discussion today so we can talk about how to make them less burdensome.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sue and Connie, for the invite to be here today, and thank you to Elyse and Janice for being on this panel. I'm actually really excited. I had some stuff that I wanted to talk about, but I think that I could probably give a different perspective. We've talked about a lot of the statistics. We've mentioned earlier that I currently work as the Chief Operating Officer at Rock the Vote, but in another lifetime I also worked as a campaigner, so I think that a lot of the stuff that we talk about in the abstract, I've actually seen in practice. So Yeah.
Thank you.
So all of the things that we've talked about on all the data and all of the all of the statistics that we've seen, like I've actually lived it. I've seen it. I've seen the barriers. I've had to deal with power brokers and gatekeepers and all of the had to look for sponsors for people. But I guess I can start with like backing up and saying that I'm sure. Actually, let me take a show of hands. Did anyone ever expect to get involved in politics or advocacy whenever, like, back in the day, or?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I was gonna marry a
Yeah.
rich man.
Yeah, advocacy
afraid of
was
corporate
always
law.
part of it.
Oh.
So, I've been around like politics and campaigns for a little over a decade now, and I came here from Texas about 10 years ago, and it was really nothing I ever thought of ever getting involved in. I grew up in Texas, and I'm sure you've heard the mentality of especially with the Latino community, that our vote doesn't matter, especially in Texas. We're like a hardcore red state. That's interestingly changing now, which is cool to see. But I was one of those people. I was like, okay, I like politics. I'm interested in it. I'm mostly interested in structural inequalities and why does the world suck? And so, that's why I went to school. But I was like one of those older millennials that was like, oh, I want to do something bigger with my life, but I don't know what to do. And so I like tried to escape. I ended up in Virginia. Ended up working at the Virginia General Assembly just sort of on a whim, as I was doing. I was a research assistant at Old Dominion University, doing both qualitative and quantitative research. And when I got to the General Assembly, that was like on the heels of SB 1070. That was the probable cause mandate that they were trying to push across the country. ALEC was, which essentially, if you're not familiar with it, it deputized local authorities to act as immigration agents. So anybody who local authorities suspected to be undocumented, that they could say, hey, show me your papers, and then they could be detained and all of these things. So good thing it didn't pass, but it was one of the bills that I had been sort of personally following. I was like, what is going to happen with this thing? I can't believe that we're dealing with this. And listening to people talk about the community, the Latino community at the General Assembly, it's like I could easily have known any of these people that they're trying to deport. And so it was like that moment where I had always been interested in like trying to change, like, or effect change somehow. And so I took the advice of somebody, I don't even remember at this point who it was, like 1,000 people, and that was to jump on a campaign. And so this is sort of I don't know, just the moment where I started to think about, or I started to see, like, in action. Whenever I started working on a campaign, I saw predominantly men, predominantly older men, and this was everywhere that I went. I worked in the 5th District on a campaign, a congressional campaign, and so my job was doing a lot of fundraising. And so I saw how difficult fundraising is. Like, we spent from 9 o'clock until 7, 8 o'clock in the evening making phone calls and going through all of that process. It is a time suck, and it's terrible. It keeps you away from voters, but it's a real problem. But the other part of it, I think that I've really been sort of obsessing about, and that is a problem, and why I personally have become sort of a advocate of campaign finance reform, is that if you look at the actual demographics and you break down like who donors are, same people, predominantly male, predominantly white, predominantly older people, and their geographic distribution is pretty centered around a couple of areas, like New York, big city areas. So over time, I just sort of figured, okay, well, I'm seeing there's not a lot of women in these fundraising places. There are definitely not a lot of people of color, definitely not a lot of Latinos in Virginia. Virginia at that time was like 6% of the population. And so I've gone back and forth between working on campaigns and then also working with nonprofit advocacy groups. And I've sort of seen like the differences and how we sort of have to change these narratives. So some of the things that I noticed doing fundraising with campaigns, and then also for particularly for women and women of color, is that you hear from the donors like, oh well, I don't think that you're a viable candidate. Like what is your path? Like more so than anything that I've ever seen when I've worked for a white man. Like what is your pathway to victory? Like what like even if we're like in a solidly Republican district, you know, a woman will always a woman in a competitive district is faced with that question more so than I've heard just on the ground. So the fundraising thing is definitely a huge issue, and so some of the things that I've done personally with some of the activities that I got involved in we're building the pipeline. We're looking at who are the people that I know on the ground, and how can I get them to be that sponsor and that advocate for women of color that we're looking to run. And so this has sort of just been an ongoing personal project, and this was before 2020. When was it? 2016. This is before 2016. Whenever we had this explosion of folks that wanted to run, and you know, we often get asked like, what are some of the reasons why we've seen so many people, especially women of color, that are running now. And I think that there is a lot to be said about like whenever you're directly affected by some of the terrible things that are going on, you know, dismantling of our current immigration system and just like over policing of communities of color, like that's, I mean, we really stepped up to the plate on this. So, but we do. We have more at stake for sure, but I also think that we are encountering a lot of these barriers, and so one of the some of the other things that I've noticed working with nonprofit organizations is that I saw a statistic recently about how in philanthropy and like tax deductible, or you know, with C3, and I didn't see a figure for C4, like organizations that are headed by people of color only get like 6 to 7% of the money. And so you're talking about nonprofit fatigue. Like fundraising is difficult, but fundraising when you're a person of color, whether you're a candidate or if you're doing it for a nonprofit organization, is really difficult. And then C4 fundraising, like forget it. It's really difficult to raise that money, and keep in mind that C4 organizations are the political advocacy arms. They're the ones who tend to do not just like political outreach and advocacy and lobbying, but they also do GOTV, reach out to underrepresented communities. So if you're looking at funding disparities and you're looking to increase that number, like that's certainly a thing that we could do in order to fix that gap. But I didn't want to spend too much time like talking about all of the things and all of the terribleness of campaigns, because I know that there have been a lot of great organizations that are doing things on the ground, that talking about like the data and talking about how we can lift up people of color and women of color in particular. But I recently read an article, you may have seen it, it came out I think last week, from the Knight Foundation, and it talked about non-voters. And non-voters, it's like a 68-page article. I'm kind of obsessed with looking at things that are wrong with society, and so I like read the entire thing. But like people who are but people who tend to be non-voters tend to be women. They're overrepresented women, and then also voters between the ages of 18 to 24. So like I started thinking about this other thing that I read, which was a book by Eitan Hirsch. He's from Tufts University. He wrote this book recently called Politics is for Power, and he talks about how with people who are voters, like it's sort of like the other side of it. He was also an advisor on this study. But he talks about the other side of it, of like who are the people who are active, and it's mostly women and mostly women of color. So, but back to the Knight Foundation thing, I sort of think about like what are some of the things that we could be doing on the ground, whether you're on a campaign or whether you're with a nonprofit organization. I try to talk about these things simultaneously because they're interconnected. But what some of the things that I've noticed are the I don't know, how do I say this, calling out privilege whenever you're seeing somebody saying, I mean, we're constant, like women of color have been living these discriminatory experiences throughout all of our life. And now, you know, there's this influx of people that want to get involved. There's a lot of people, like, we've been basically born organizers. And, you know, for us to be more represented, like, we need to have more support. And part of that is for people to not look at politics and advocacy as a zero-sum game. And those conversations are really hard to have. I know I've had some really hard ones over the years. But calling out privilege whenever but also having the support of people who are in positions of privilege, and ensuring that there is that level of trust within communities to ensure that we're all lifting each other up, is really important. And that's not just important for people who are running for office, but also for campaigners. I mean, I'm never going to run for office. I don't have any desire to. I understand, like, all of the inner workings of that. I love being behind the scenes, and I love doing all of that work. But I've been in a situation or several situations actually, where I'll go to a training or I'll go to something, only person of color, only Latina for sure. And so building that pipeline of people of color, women of color who are those campaigners, and who, you know, I'm never going to run for office, but maybe they'll run for office too. Those two particular pipelines are really important in order to build. And I'm trying to think of what are some of the other things. Yeah, there was one mention earlier about what thinking about what is a viable candidate in a different way. Whenever I've run campaigns, there are two things that I keep in mind, and that's what my fundraising goal is. And so every time I've ever done fundraising for anybody, especially marginalized communities, I think, okay, what's going to be really impressive, and then I have to exceed that by like 50% in order for people to take this person who is from a marginalized community seriously. And but it's hard. It's really hard to raise money, especially when you're a woman, because of that, you know, really racially homogenous donor pool, and because you come across some of those barriers. So, like, having these conversations and understanding the way that fundraising works is certainly a way to help bolster the representation from the local level all the way up to the federal level. I didn't want to take too much more time. That way we have some time for discussion.
Thank you. Office in the policy realm. Are there prevalent policies? Are they questioned more about their political plans? It's something that I think has been fascinating to see with the candidates that we are looking at today.
I think women, just in general, are always held to higher standards. You know, whether it's campaigning, and whether it's the complete erasure from, you know, the media, or even just the nitty gritty of their policy. I mean, there's always